welcome again to everyone in the audience, as well as our panelists who have joined us today for what is the second session of the Behavioural Insights team's Build Back Better webinar series, with today's topic being sustainable transport in a post-lockdown world. My name is Carolyn Reiner. I am an advisor in the Energy, Transport and Sustainability team at the Behavioural Insights team, and I'm leading on much of our transport work. I will be co-hosting this session today with my colleague Toby Park, who heads up the Energy, Transport and Sustainability team at BIT. We will be splitting the conversation today into three sections. Firstly, reflecting on the imperative for shifting mobility habits and norms in the UK, and thinking about what good even looks like in terms of greener mobility. Secondly, we will then talk about the impacts of the current situation and the opportunities and challenges caused by COVID, and that this provides for change. And then finally, we will of course also talk about specific measures that we might envisage to help us get there, to reach that goal, and about the different actions that different stakeholders can take. But just before we kick off, a little bit of housekeeping. So my colleague Toby and I are going to offer a few brief remarks at the beginning of each discussion section, and then devote the bulk of our time to our three panelists. So we'll spend about 40 to 45 minutes discussing and then open up the floor for an audience QA at the end for about the final 10 to 15 minutes. So please feel encouraged to ask questions as we go along. You can do that by using the Q&A chat function in Zoom. And my colleague Toby will keep an eye on your questions and comments throughout and ask a selection of these to our panelists during the final Q&A. And finally, you should also be aware that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available to watch on our website. Okay. So let me introduce our panelists. So welcome Lewis Brencher. Lewis is the Communications Director at Transport for Wales. He has over a decade of experience within the transport sector in Wales across operational, commercial, and communication roles. He now leads the development of all communication activities for the rail industry in Wales. Welcome, Lewis. Secondly, we have Gavin Ellis. He's a co-founder and director at HubUp, an award-winning environmental charity, and Gavin leads environmental behavior change campaigns on a wide range of issues, ranging from transport to plastic pollution, and he has over 15 years of experience in communicating environmental issues. Welcome, Gavin. And last but not least, we have Dr. Neil Kinnear. Neil is the head of behavioral science at Transport Research Laboratory. He's a chartered psychologist in the study of human behavior and transport. Neil has extensive expertise in many aspects of transport behavior, but in particular on young road users, education, electric vehicle adoption and use, and future technologies. Welcome, Neil. We're glad to have all of you on board. And of course, then there is Toby Park and myself who will be moderating this session. Okay, so without further ado, let's get stuck into the first segment of the discussion. So this section should simply serve as a scene setter mostly. So as it stands, our transport system is clearly not fit for 2030 and beyond. The transport sector is now the largest emitter of carbon emissions in the UK. It's also the leading cause of statistical death due to air pollution in the tens of thousands each year. One could further argue that our transport system locks in various other social ills like regional inequalities, social isolation, and so on. So taking this high-level view, turning to each of our panelists with all these things in mind, what are the most important changes in travel behaviours and practices that you'd like to see and why? So starting with Lewis, for Transport for Wales, what are your organisation's priorities for the future of transport, and what are the regional differences in the UK for these priorities?
So I think the key fundamental priorities of Transport for Wales are linked to some important policy and legal requirements that have been set up by the Welsh Government. Some of you may be aware there's a piece of legislation in Wales, which is known as the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which puts a duty on public bodies to ensure that we consider the future well-being of people not yet born in terms of any policy decisions that are made. And the entire establishment of Transport for Wales has been built around some of those principles, which has meant that whenever we've made decisions around how we plan our programmes around future development of the transport network, we've had to make sure that we demonstrate and actively consider future implications. We have a really strong commitment around decarbonisation, and in fact in the last 2 days we've published an update on our sustainability objectives. So I think in terms of future intent, we've already set out quite a clear direction in that, off the back of the important piece of legislation that determines activities within Wales. We've challenged ourselves to achieve carbon neutral by 2030, and even in the last year we've already managed to see a reduction in carbon from our activities by around 6%. Some of the rolling stock in the future we've procured has all been future-proofed to ensure that we're able to change the way that a lot of the rolling stock is powered. And we're also working across a broader remit around other forms of public transport and active travel to ensure we help support that carbon reduction. I think COVID is obviously going to be a key part of the discussion, but the longer term and the largest threat is undoubtedly from climate change. So I think there's a really difficult balance between dealing with it here and now, and some of the big challenges we have in terms of behaviour change from COVID, whilst keeping our eyes on the prize in terms of the longer term impact around climate change and how we can support the decarbonisation agenda.
Thank you, Lewis. Gavin, over to you. Obviously, business travel is a big part of mobility today. What are the changes you think we need to see there in terms of business travel?
Well, I mean, I think some of them we've already seen, and they've been kind of enforced in terms of much more flexible working, which obviously has just had to happen, and it's happened overnight. And I've talked through in my presentation a bit more detail about some of the insights we've seen there. I think around sort of business travel as well, but flying particularly. Again, that's been kind of enforced. That's had to be stripped right back, and it will be interesting to see whether it ever returns to where it is. I think then in terms of what we're particularly focusing on at Hubbub is issues around commuting, so promoting active travel, walking and cycling. Obviously, very pleased to see announcements yesterday around cycling. I think as well, just trying to sort of speed the transition towards electric vehicles being more commonplace and more easily chargeable. I think that's a really important component. And I think there's a point about sort of regional rail, improving regional rail and the cost of public transport outside of London, which is still disproportionately high and prohibitive in many parts of the country. So I think they're some of the key things that will kind of have an impact on commuting to work and the subsequent carbon emissions. And I think there's the public, what we've seen is the public opinion is really behind those shifts. So the public do want to cycle and walk more. The public we did a lot of polling during lockdown, and one of the things that the public really noticed was less traffic, less air pollution, and they were the kind of things that the public said they wanted to be retained from that experience of lockdown. I think that has to be countered against some of the kind of realities that we're starting to see. So there's one thing what the public say they want to see, but then what we're actually seeing in reality now that lockdown is eased is that secondhand car sales are through the roof. The roads are getting really busy again. So there's perhaps an idealistic view of what we'd like to see, but then the kind of practicality of people not wanting to get on public transport, social distancing, and actually feeling like maybe it's safer to be in a car, and if we don't have a car, then maybe now's the time to buy one secondhand. So I think that they're the kind of challenges that we're going to be faced with over the coming months, the kind of idealistic view of what we all liked during lockdown, but the realities of what this kind of post-COVID world means in terms of travel.
Absolutely. Neil, just picking up on one of the points that Gavin made in terms of people actually now going out there, you know, buying secondhand cars, not wanting to get back onto public transport. In terms of new and greener technologies, what do you think our priorities should be around that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, ultimately we're looking for a system, a transport system that's holistic, efficient, affordable, safe, and integrated and inclusive. And all of those things can be competing priorities, or they can be complementary priorities. Ultimately, you know, COVID's brought this paradox, I think, that everything we were working towards before COVID was the ultimate aim of reducing single vehicle car use and trying to encourage shared mobility services or active travel. And while the active travel has been supported by this, and we might see an increase post-COVID, what we've also encouraged is actual single person travel and remain in your bubble and distancing. So we've reduced capacity on public transport, and we've even put out the message, don't use public transport at a point. So we've created a confusion to the public now, and the behavioural response to that will be really interesting as time goes on. And it will take some, you know, we'll come on to policies later, but it will take some strong leadership to start driving confidence in public transport and reducing anxieties and the uncertainties around that. I think what's important to also realise, just a final point, that transport emissions come from the movement of people and goods, and the freight industry, you know, has a big part to play in reducing emissions here. And you know, I had a great phrase that while we want shared mobility, we also want shared non-mobility, and that's the delivery of goods to people who are actually just sitting at home and replacing the journeys that they would otherwise make to get a good from a shop, actually bring it to them. But that has to be done efficiently, and that requires some probably flexibility within the system to make sure that goods are delivered efficiently, and we're replacing journeys with fewer deliveries rather than increasing journeys to give people things on time and within hour slots, etc. So there's a lot of challenges, and COVID has really thrown things up in the air and created a mix of both opportunity and issues for us that have raised from this.
Thank you, Neil. I liked your sentence that we've created confusion for the public in terms of what they're supposed to be doing. So let's look at that in a bit more detail now in discussion 2. Here we're going to move on to think about the current situation and how things have changed so far during lockdown and shortly after lockdown. My colleague Toby will provide us with a bit more detailed introduction to this. So Toby, over to you.
Thanks, Clara. Yes, I think, you know, we all know that COVID has clearly been enormously disruptive to our ability to travel, as well as our need to travel, and of course the way we travel. And you know, at the peak in the UK, we saw a 95% reduction in car use, for example. But as Neil just said, that's of course bounced rapidly back, and it could even get worse than it was to begin with, given sort of safety concerns and so on. But I think interestingly, the experience has also shifted perceptions among citizens, among policymakers of what's possible. So, you know, under normal times, I think policy tends to pursue incremental improvements, that is sort of same but slightly better behavioural outcomes, i.e. we pursue a future in which we still travel in much the same way and perhaps for much the same reasons, but we gradually shift towards more sustainable modes of transport. But my sense is that actually the level of disruption we've had during COVID provides quite a rare opportunity for more of a sort of whole system reset, like never before. So, you know, rethinking about how we study, how we socialise, how we work and so on could actually see potentially bigger changes in society that more radically change our transport needs, or at least in theory. I think, you know, in reality, we know that changes in attitudes often don't lead to significant changes in behaviours, particularly once the context which gave rise to those changed attitudes reverts back to normal. And we might find that actually behaviours do revert to normal once people perceive the world to be a little bit more normal again, and find ourselves slipping very easily into those old transport routines. But I do think it's interesting to consider whether there actually are certain conditions in place right now that might trigger mechanisms for sustained behaviour change that we know from the evidence can happen. So I just want to very briefly outline 4 potential mechanisms that we might see pan out. So first, we know that moments of disruption can aid behaviour change simply because old habits are momentarily broken. So for instance, we ran a study in Portland which found that people who had just moved home were 4 times as likely to adopt a cycle share scheme as residents who already lived in that area. So that's the sort of so-called fresh start effect, which we may see playing out now. Second, we know that moments of turmoil or imposed constraints can also shift habits because they force us to explore new options, which in some case might have been better all along. So a well-known study of the London rail strike a number of years ago showed exactly this, and millions of people were forced to find a new route to work, but a sizable majority actually stuck with those new routes after the strike ended. And the same logic could be applied to many businesses now who've been forced to adopt work from home policies and who are only now perhaps realizing that that actually brings some benefits, obviously financial, that maybe they want to maintain. Thirdly, there might be occasions where we've been forced to overcome sort of initial frictions or barriers, but once that's gone, sustaining a new behavior is relatively easy. So for instance, COVID might have been the impetus to finally fix our bike, but now that that's done, continuing to use it is relatively easy. And finally, there's also, I think, cause for some optimism where a change has been somewhat baked into the choice architecture, by which I mean, behavior in general, but I think particularly our transport behavior is massively influenced by the context around it. So the availability of infrastructure and so on. And of course, the announcements yesterday for new cycle lanes and so on will massively help that. So I think, in sum, I would prescribe some caution that we shouldn't assume behavior is going to change just because, but there are clearly some mechanisms through which change could sustain. So that's my initial thoughts on the issue. We'll hear more thoughts from our panel in a moment, but first I'm going to hand over to Gavin Ellis to share the results of a recent survey from employers about commuting and business travel, which I think picks up on some of those themes. So over to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Toby. Yes, I'm just going to spend 5 minutes quickly running through some of the key insights from a survey that Hubbub did with Behavioural Insights team recently. Just picked out one of the headlines here, which is that 85% of the organisations we spoke to said they anticipate making changes in travel and working patterns post COVID-19. So, 85% don't see it going back to normal, back to life as it was before, which I think is a really high number, and there's signs of encouragement there. So who did we speak to? We spoke to 46 employers. It was pretty much an equal spread of micro businesses, SMEs, and large companies. And the vast majority, 94%, already allowed employees to work remotely before lockdown and before pre-COVID. But for the most part, it didn't happen very often. So 83% said their employees only really worked up to 1 day per week remotely. So it did happen, but it happened quite sporadically. As well as those employers, we also had a separate survey. We spoke to about 241 employees of those businesses and discovered that 89% of those employees are keen or very keen to work remotely more often. And the next slide. So I'm still stuck on the same slide here. I think that's
with us.
Is Carolyn frozen?
Apologies, everyone. That was my internet having to fail today. Let me just quickly reshare my slides. Apologies for that. Gavin, I think we were on this slide 3.
Exactly, thank you. Yeah, so what's it like being working under lockdown? So for the most part, actually quite positive. And where there were challenges, it was generally felt that they could be relatively easily overcome. So more than 3/4 agreed that while travel restrictions have presented some difficulties, they have been solvable, and it's brought about a lot of positive changes, some unforeseen positive changes. So from an organisational point of view, 87% said it's caused them to discover new ways of working which have been positive. And from an employee point of view, almost 4 in 5 believe that these forced travel disruptions have brought benefits to staff, and 94% are really keen to have more work-life balance in the future. And I think this really comes back to Toby's points before about these, the moment of turmoil or change, which actually forces a change, which then people find perhaps was better all along. They just didn't know it because it seemed a bit too difficult to make that change in the first place, overcoming those initial barriers, which might have prevented people from wanting to make this kind of wholesale shift. So I think this is potentially quite a good example of exactly what Toby was talking about there in the intro. And then why retain these positive changes? So the most influential factors from the businesses we spoke to, over 90% said company culture, employee well-being and work-life balance, 86% saying productivity, 83% saying client or customer expectations, digital tools, platforms, and actually probably surprisingly low, I think, is environmental impact from community. So only 83% saying that, and then 79% saying employee retention and recruitment. So there's definitely a theme that you can see there around the benefit it's having for people, for well-being, for work-life balance. There's obviously still that influence of client or customer expectations, which I think can't be ignored, whether there is an expectation there or whether there's a perceived expectation that the client or customer wants you to be there face to face, or whether your employer wants you to be at your desk. Yeah, that's worth bearing in mind. 19 employers said they plan to return to their office in the autumn or winter. So only 1 has already returned. 7 say they'll do it sometime in the summer, 2 in spring 2021, 5 haven't made any plans, and 4 are considering making remote working the default for the foreseeable future. So this might be a permanent shift. So really interesting to see where the kind of level of appetite is among these organisations we spoke to go back to work. And as you can see, not much appetite to go back to as it was pre-COVID. So when they do go back to work, almost all, 92% are saying they're likely to encourage more remote working. 81% will encourage more flexible working, such as compressed or core working hours. 75% are likely to reduce the amount of business travel within the UK, and 75% and 72% likely to reduce the amount of business travel internationally. So definitely a trend towards less travel, whether it's within the UK or internationally. And more than 2/3 saying that they're likely to reduce office space now as a result of more flexible working. And business travel has also been put on hold. So 59% of the organisations we spoke to said their staff previously travelled long distance for business 4 or more times a year. Only 17% said they anticipate long distance business travel to be absolutely essential post-COVID. So very few saying that it was totally necessary. Clearly seeing some of the cost saving benefits. And now, again, coming back to Toby's points, overcoming some of those initial barriers that might have existed around using tools like this, like Zoom and Teams and others. We've been forced to use them, forced to get to know them, and have come to realise that they're actually really effective tools that can be very successful in terms of replacing face-to-face meetings or indeed events like this one. And then finally, considerations around reducing long distance business travel. So 82% saying sales and relationship building, so that need for face-to-face, particularly for sales related jobs, productivity. 79% saying environmental impact. 74% saying things like innovation, employee well-being, again, client customer expectations. 68% saying customer culture. And interestingly, nobody at all, we had included air mile perks as an option here, and nobody selected that option. So that would suggest, at least among this sample, that the air mile perks are maybe a thing of the past. And that's a quick whiz through the key insights. If you want to receive more information about that survey or indeed anything else, then do drop me an email. My email's there, gavin@hubbub.org.uk. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Gavin. On the whole, these are pretty encouraging findings, I think, and they do suggest somewhat of a shift in mindsets, at least, especially regarding the air miles. I think that's an interesting finding that no one selected that. So yeah, it does seem to be a thing of the past, perhaps. Just before we move on to a couple of more questions about this, just to say that for those of you who have questions about the survey and the details of how we conducted that survey, Toby has been answering some of these questions in the Q&A chat, and his responses should be visible to everybody. And also, just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please post it on the Q&A chat. We will pick up on some of those later on during the Q&A session at the end. Okay, but for now, a couple of questions about how COVID is posing new opportunities and challenges to us in terms of green mobility. So Lewis, over to you. So we've just heard from Gavin that about 85% of businesses have indicated that they do anticipate working patterns and the travel to sustainably change post-COVID. That is an overwhelming majority. So as someone who is serving a lot of the UK's commuters, what is the most striking finding for you? And what might the implications be for public transport in the future from your perspective?
I think one of the most striking findings for us has been people's willingness to follow advice and guidance. And actually, I think there's probably a lesson there overall for the whole of society, in that actually, I think people were generally surprised how much people did follow advice and how much compliance there was with some of the clear direction from government. Certainly, you know, we saw around about 95% drop in revenue when you take into account refunds, probably went to about 100% at the start of COVID. And whilst we've seen a slow, gradual increase in demand, we're at around about sort of 20, 30% at the moment, though the demand hasn't been where we would have expected it. So we would have presumed that commuting would have been the more necessary arm of demand, that we would have seen growth. But actually, some of the biggest spikes we've seen have been tourism, people traveling to the beach and places like that. So I think what's been fascinating for us is that the peak, in its traditional sense, feels very different now, and how we've had to communicate and manage that demand has had to change as a result. So whereas we've been very much focused on working with businesses within Wales, and we've done some similar research to Hubbub, which is showing broadly similar findings, actually the demand is not coming from that space, which has been a real surprise. And indeed, actually, the largest areas of growth have actually been over weekends. So on a Sunday, generally, we've seen around about 30% comparison to pre-COVID. Whereas Monday, earlier this week, we saw about 20%. So the broader societal changes have been quite significant and have meant that we've needed to quite rapidly change the way that we approach how we influence that demand. I think the other thing I would say quickly is how people travel has been a huge opportunity to influence. And we've seen, again, how people have been willing to adopt active travel as a mode quite quickly. But I think the other thing that we can be really focused on, and for Transport for Wales being part of government, is thinking about whether people even indeed need to travel. So rather than responding to these changing business behaviour and priorities, actually there are opportunities in there to support a broader ambition around decarbonisation by encouraging working from home where people can, and making sure that we design our services around that change in demand. So we've launched an integrated responsive transport pilot called Flexi, which is allowing us to deliver bus services in a very different way than previously. So rather than running traditional timetabled services with the potential to not carry very many people, we've actually designed a system where we can be much more demand-led, which has shown to be much more successful than might have been previously. So there's a huge amount of opportunity in there, but I think the way of previous behaviour has been very, very different coming out of lockdown than we would have expected, which is something that's really tested us in terms of our ability to adapt and change the way we work.
Thank you, Lewis. Yeah, I agree. I mean, in terms of the opportunities, I think most people, especially behavioral scientists, are saying that the opportunities are big now, and that we need to use this timely moment. Neil, looking at this through a behavioral lens, I'm also considering what Lewis just pointed out in terms of the behavior change post-lockdown actually being more tourists jumping onto public transport or traveling rather than commuters coming back onto public transport. So thinking about these disruptions that COVID has had, and also the changes that we've seen post-lockdown, where in the transport system do you think behavior change might readily emerge and also last sustainably without much deliberate intervention, and why?
Okay, so I think one of the key areas we've been tracking transport or vehicles on the strategic road networks. So it's like the motorway and A road system in England, and that's shown, you can easily track when there was a government announcement to a drop in traffic, and was at its peak usually down around 60-70%, with much of it still being freight and necessary travel. We've come back recently, as you would expect, but it's still down 20% on pre-COVID times. But what's really interesting is that we're not seeing the peak on, similar to what Lewis was saying from the data that he's aware of. We're not seeing this return to a peak that everyone. And I think that clearly shows and blends in with the survey that Gavin and yourselves were presenting there, that companies are much more flexible now. They're offering flexibility for workers in the times that they work, so that they can work around childcare. They're allowing people to work from home much more. And in fact, many companies may not even bother with offices in future at all. But I think that's the potential sustainable area. And where we've seen behaviour change is that now everyone can use video conferencing facilities to communicate with their work colleagues and across their industry. Now, that's something that we all had the technical capability to do, but we didn't really use it that much. Or certainly in my experience, I don't think we used it as much, certainly not as much as we do now. But this situation has forced everyone to become sort of knowledgeable and know how to work Zoom and all the other types of video conferencing facilities, and most companies have had to adapt and offer things like Teams and stuff and Google Meets, so that people can coordinate and work on documents at the same time, etc. And that's a behaviour change that is likely to last because it's shown to work and people have got into a habit now. And so I think that side is really positive. What's more difficult is the leisure travel, where people were forced to travel locally, which was really positive, and people started to walk and cycle more. But as we've seen restrictions lifted, people want to travel further and they want to get away to the beaches and get really away from the local area because they've had enough of it recently. And ultimately, some of those trips are the ones that are the most polluting, and most of them are done by car because people are traveling as a family with possibly luggage or bikes on the roof rack or other sort of leisure goods they want to take with them. So they're the types of travel that we need to impact, and I'm not sure that we'll see the behaviour change there unless we make real strong policy changes like we've started to see around enabling the social environment to suit cycling and walking.
Thank you, Neil. So moving on from thinking about the current situation and what has changed, in the third discussion section, we're going to think about what needs to be done and the different policy initiatives, industry efforts, campaigns, etc. What do we need to adopt both right now to maximize these opportunities presented to us, and to the longer term? How do we get the balance right between greener transport versus overall less travel, for example? So Neil, just sort of throwing the question back to you in terms of what you just said, that some of these changes in terms of business travel or commuting being things that last because companies have realized that they can do stuff online quite easily, whereas leisure travel perhaps is a more difficult behaviour to change. So clearly there are transport behaviours that have been impacted by COVID, but we still need a lot of deliberate intervention to really shift some of these big ticket behaviours, including such as the amount we fly, the types of cars we drive, and also achieving radical shifts in active travel. And as you've suggested, this obviously isn't easy, and transport behaviours in particular can be quite entrenched, subject to a degree of lock-in because of infrastructure and past decisions by governments, but also by individuals. So for example, the car you've bought, well, you're not going to replace that car within a year or two. So also thinking about the recent £2 billion government programme to encourage active travel by investing in infrastructure, repair vouchers, active travel prescriptions by GPs, etc. What's your high-level view on how we should be thinking about shifting transport behaviours that are really ingrained to the scale that would be needed to hit Paris targets? Can we nudge our way there softly, or is this more about big infrastructure spending? Are there any clever ways we can lean on the market, for example?
So it's a big question with many parts of the answer, but I think what we've realised from the situation that we've experienced over the past few months is that government leadership and policy with good quality input from behavioural science for messaging, coercion, persuasion, along with soft enforcement, can bring really big mass behaviour change. And a lot of the things that were said we could never achieve, like people walking, cycling, actually we've been able to see sort of increases in that when the environment is right for it. So when the streets are quieter, they feel safer. There's less. The air quality is better. It's more pleasant. People enjoy it, and people they go locally to things. And people have probably realised that there's a lot more locally than they realised. And really, policy still needs to support that. Now we have an opportunity of change, but it still needs that leadership. Because policy drives behaviour change, which is then supported by all of these behaviour change techniques and approaches such as positive messaging and good quality messaging and linking in with that persuasion and coercion. So that for me is one of the really important things. So consumers have more choice now. They have the ability to compare their travel modes, and we really need to harness that and work with businesses like we've seen before to make sure that both business travel and leisure travel are supported to be as clean as possible. EVs will obviously play their part and are a critical factor in fading out high emission vehicles, but there's a long way to go there, and there's many significant barriers and challenges for them, and there's a difficulty in encouraging them too much, where actually reducing car use and opening space for walking and cycling on the roads is clearly critical as well. So there's some real positive messages coming out, like yesterday's announcement around using our space to encourage these things, but there's a lot of significant challenges too.
Absolutely, yeah. So Neil, thanks for that. And Lewis, over to you, just in response to some of the ideas that Neil has just pitched. Does this resonate with you from a government perspective in terms of the types of measures that you're, as Transport for Wales, are also thinking about? I know you've mentioned at the very beginning that actually decarbonisation is one of the things that concerns you most. So I guess my question is, how boldly are you thinking about influencing citizen choices around transport, and what kind of approaches are on the table? And if I can allow myself a third question to that, what are some of the policies that you as Transport for Wales or even DFT would consider in terms of not just thinking about greener transport, but actually thinking about reducing transport and travel overall?
So I think there's two ways of looking at it. There's the sort of the macro picture, and then there's the specific detailed ideas that you might look at. So I think from a sort of a macro perspective, I think this has probably been one of the largest single changes to how society functions. I can imagine it in living memory in a lot of ways. So I think from a sort of a government and policy perspective, whilst it's hugely challenging and there's some massively complex issues to deal with, there is certainly an opportunity to do things very differently. And I think we can all probably recall examples of major policy announcements from governments right across the UK that we probably would never have imagined a year ago happening. So I think that's a real indication of the level of change. And with that level of change, I think it does present a real opportunity for governments to continue to do things really differently and really challenge itself to think really creatively about policy. And whilst there will be some things that it has to do because it's dealing with fundamental economic challenges and health issues around coronavirus, it may be that we are able to fast track some of those longer term objectives that have been there anyway. So we need to seize that opportunity. I mean, just in terms of some of the specific detail I mentioned earlier around working from home, is that something that we want to actively encourage as it supports decreased demand overall and therefore the wider decarbonisation agenda? Do we want to think about how this affects society from an equalities perspective as well? So from a socioeconomic perspective, those people that may have had challenges around accessing roles or jobs or economic hubs and may have been limited by factors such as the cost of public transport or even private transport, are we now able to provide better opportunity for those people through remote working, through things like digital capability that they wouldn't previously have had the option to use? And similarly, if there are people with disabled people, for example, who may now be able to access work in a way that they would have struggled to do previously. So I think that we have to look across the whole of society to seize those opportunities. There are more specific things that we can do. So if I use the rail industry as an example, the tradition of the rail industry has very much been, you can walk up on any one day and jump on a train with no major issues. Obviously, there is an incentive there with pricing to try and get people to book in advance, but fundamentally it's been an open network which has operated in that way since it was created. You've got operators like the LNER and others that are now operating on a reservation-only basis, which is a fundamental change to the way certain modes within the transport network operate. And similarly, I mentioned that the Flexi pilot that we're operating, which is a very different way of delivering bus services. There's huge amounts of other ways of looking at things like car sharing, ride sharing. EVs are all part of the mix. So there's probably a number of different specific interventions, but I think we just need to make sure that we're looking at it in the broader context and making sure we seize that opportunity. But I think everything is on the table to be discussed because there's already been so much change. How we then do it while still considering all those various different people's protected characteristics and those broader objectives we want to achieve in society. I think that's the challenge for government at the moment, which I'm sure is one that all governments are considering at the moment.
Thank you, Lewis. So we've heard Lewis talk about government's perspective on this and what governments can do. Looking back at businesses, Gavin, employers clearly have a particular position of influence on our travel behaviours when it comes to commuting, but also business travel more generally, obviously. So their decisions around company car parks, provision of parking, subsidising public transport or cycling, their offer of working from home, etc. All these things have huge impacts on our habits. But more broadly, in your experience, what does it take to get businesses on board with this agenda and acting boldly? I mean, we've heard very positive, suggested sort of shifts in mindset from the survey results. But what are any lessons that you might be able to share from past campaigns and your experience in this space?
Yeah, well, I suppose maybe just before I do, and just to pick up on a few of the points that have been raised, I think one of the things that we're talking to a lot of businesses at the moment about is the fact that with increased flexible working, they're now facing a challenge of, and it comes back to this point of decarbonisation, but actually in many cases what they're realising is that the carbon emissions are just being displaced, they're just being moved elsewhere. So whereas previously they might have had 20,000 employees across 5 or 6 very energy efficient offices, which they've spent many years making as efficient as possible. Now they've got those 20,000 people spread across 20,000 probably not very energy efficient homes with all the subsequent carbon emissions that come with that. So I think it's important not to just assume that flexible working necessarily means less carbon emissions. It means probably reduced carbon emissions from travel, but it might mean increased carbon emissions elsewhere from household energy use. Particularly, I mean, we've been doing this through generally really good weather as well. So come winter, when people are spending a lot more time at home with their heating on, which wouldn't normally be on during the day, then we'll see a real spike in home energy use as a result of that. So that's something that a lot of companies that we're talking to are grappling with at the moment. I think another idea that's gaining quite a lot of credence, and I think is really interesting, is the idea of 15-minute communities, 15-minute cities. So the idea that you have within a city anything that, or within a town or city, everything that a community, everything that a household would need to access within 15 minutes walk or cycle, so that there isn't the need for huge numbers of people to be traveling in and out of city centres with all of the subsequent pollution and congestion that comes with that. So I think there's something really interesting in that obviously requires a lot of would require a lot of planning and sort of cooperation from the developers and that kind of thing. But I think that's an idea that's really interesting and really worth exploring further, that we don't need to have these big city centres that huge numbers of people travel in and out of. And certainly that, again, conversations that we're having with a lot of businesses, that's an idea that seems to be really gaining traction at the moment, and perhaps having more hubs rather than big HQs.
Thank you, Gavin. I think that idea about 15-minute cities is a really nice one to conclude sort of the main bulk of this discussion in the webinar today. So I'd like to wrap it up here in terms of just discussing between the five of us, and I'd like to now open up the floor to the audience Q&A. So thank you all for participating in this and answering all my questions. And I'm handing over now to Toby, who's been monitoring and already answering some of your questions, but he's also gone through them and selected a few that he's now going to ask to our panelists. All right, over to you, Toby.
Thank you. Yes, I've been answering as many as I can, but also obviously trying to select ones to ask our panelists and make sure that I can still listen to what they're saying, so I don't ask things you've already answered. So I'll do my best there, but thank you so much for all the questions. Loads of great questions coming in. I'm happy to sit online for a bit and answer those that we don't get to the best I can as well. But let's make a start. So firstly, I think something that hasn't really been mentioned too much is inclusivity. So there's a question here around, if we had to build back better, how can we use behavioural science to ensure that there's an inclusive recovery that takes into account the different travel needs and behaviours of minority groups and different demographics? So for example, we know that active travel and cycling infrastructure can sometimes negatively impact older and disabled pedestrians who might want to be using the same pavement space. We also know that hate crimes on public transport and antisocial behaviour might be more likely to be experienced by certain groups, like LGBT groups, and so on. So curious, I mean, all of our panelists, please feel free to jump in if you think you've got something to say about this, but I wonder if, Lewis, you, particularly from the government perspective and in charge of certain public transport elements, have something interesting to say about this point?
I hope I have something interesting to say, but thank you. So yeah, I think it's a fundamental question. I think it's incredibly important, because I think the way that we respond to this, if we don't consider all the various needs of people right across society, we could undo a lot of the work that we've been trying to do over previous years prior to COVID. I think, if you just use one example, face coverings has been a hugely challenging issue, particularly for disabled people. And I think we need to make sure that you design all of the various needs right at the start of any process and any change, which is a common sense approach, which I know many people are acutely aware of. But I think if we don't do that, we're going to have a lot of unintended consequences that, as we design our emergence from coronavirus, is going to potentially cut people out. And at worst scenario, at least bad scenario, is miss some brilliant opportunities to involve people more. So I think that's a really important thing we need to do. How we do it, I think, is part of the challenge, in that we need to have a really clear idea of what future we want to look like. And I think one of the things that's been interesting being part of linked to Welsh Government and from a devolved administration's perspective is seeing how subtle differences in policy and government can actually mean quite big changes in terms of how some of those policies have ended up being implemented. So I think having a really clear view of what you want society to look like, then working back from there and involving people right across the various spectrums of society, I think is fundamentally important to everything we do. But it's very challenging to do that without being really deliberate and designing it right the way through your processes. But I think it's fundamentally important we need to do that. And I think active travel is another really interesting example. How do you make sure that active travel provision doesn't negatively affect people? Equally, gender is a really important issue when designing transport. So things like trip chaining, how do you make sure that that women who generally tend to have a much less linear commute, for example, aren't designed out of any of the networks we build in the future as well? So cycle paths, for example, they need to be making sure that they are hubs rather than superhighways, so to speak, to make sure that they work for things like trip chaining as well. So there's lots and lots of different things we need to think about. But I would say it's a fundamentally important factor we need to consider in all elements of society.
Thanks, Lewis. Neil and Gavin, please feel free to add to that, but I also have plenty of other questions to get to. So maybe I'll pitch the next question, and then in your response, please feel free to expand on what Lewis has just said as well on the inclusivity point. So quite a few questions have come in on the role of businesses, and I know we have touched upon that at various points in our discussion, but it might be worth delving a bit deeper given that so many questions have come in. So for instance, someone's asked what role government has in influencing businesses. So clearly national and local governments often seek to nudge citizens, but what role do we have in nudging businesses, given that businesses hold so many important levers over our transport behaviours? Similarly, someone's asked whether free corporate parking perks, usually for the most senior people, should be taxed or banned now. And similarly, someone said from the research that we've collectively done on the panel, do we feel that nudges can be best applied in the short term to A, motivate drivers to consider and choose more sustainable modes, or instead B, motivate businesses to provide more and more convenient alternatives to the private cars? So if anyone wants to pick that up, what role do businesses have? Specifically, what role do government and perhaps other organizations, campaigners such as Hubbub, have in influencing businesses to influence citizens?
Yeah, I can pick that up briefly if you like. I mean, I think in terms of influencing business, certainly the conversations that we're having and the likes of the things like the survey that we've done recently with business, I think shows that there's a bit of an open door here at the moment, and that actually businesses are very receptive to change. They're very receptive to doing things differently. So I think actually just what we're starting to do at Hubbub is sort of trying to bring together coalitions of more kind of progressive businesses to learn from each other, to share best practice, because what we sense is that there's a real desire to change now. So I think previously it felt like, to use that analogy, it was kind of banging on a slightly closed door, whereas I think that door has been blasted open by the COVID situation, and all the reasons, all the things that Toby mentioned earlier about these times of change and times of kind of turmoil. So it's about, I think, sharing best practice and actually showing what other businesses are doing and showing that these businesses aren't alone. This is part of a kind of a wider trend in business at the moment, to be more flexible, to put people first, to obviously reduce carbon emissions and help them to meet their net zero targets. So I think there's a number of different kind of levers for it. But I think just finally, probably the thing that we've found is the most important driver at the moment, rather than it being sustainability and climate change and environment, is people. And it's all about people and well-being and putting employees first at the moment. So I think that's the lever to get businesses to change. It's about employee well-being.
Yeah, great. And Lewis, curious, from a sort of government perspective, do you see a clear role in trying to influence businesses to change their practices to enable other people to travel more sustainably?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would echo all the points that that Gavin made. Really, I think there's always a difficult balance between nudge and actual enforcement. I think my experience has been similar in that businesses are very open-minded at the moment about being willing to adapt because they've already had to adapt so significantly. I think when we communicate with businesses and we want them to change, the key fundamental is to understand what their drivers are and how we can help them to continue to grow and develop and survive what is a very difficult period. So I think we need to make sure that we communicate it in a way that is a shared endeavour and understand that we want them to succeed, because I think it'd be very easy to take quite a hard line approach in terms of trying to design in some of these fundamental changes. And I think the general feeling around the economy at the moment is that won't necessarily work. So I think we need to make sure that it's very partnership led, and I would say the nudge approach and selling the benefits of designing in some of those changes to the way people work would be the main process at the moment, because they've shown, generally speaking, businesses have shown that they are willing to adapt to what is a very different circumstance. So I think we should build on that and use that momentum.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and we clearly just got a couple of minutes left. So I want to wrap up maybe with one final question, which is simply to each of our panelists: what would be sort of the one top idea, the specific idea that you'd really like to see implemented now, given that this is a moment of opportunity, the moment of change? And while you think about that, I'll just say thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Thanks in particular, of course, to our three panelists, but also to all our audience and all the questions that have come in. Just a reminder before we go that this is part of a wider webinar series on building back better. So last week we had one on business behaviours, which will be available on the BIT website very shortly. And if you're interested, please do sign up to the next webinars coming up, which is on next Tuesday, I believe, which is on the opportunities and challenges caused by COVID for the education system. And there will be more to come, so please do keep an eye out on the BIT website and blog. But with that in mind, we've got about a minute left, so just sort of 20 seconds or so each. If each of you could maybe just pitch your top idea that you'd really like to see implemented in the short term. So I'll start off with Neil.
It's a very hard question. I mean, I think what I'd like to see is that this changes the appraisal of the transport system and for funding and appraisal of what is required and what people want, and that we can have a better and more integrated transport system going forward in planning and what's put in place as the environmental situation for people to enjoy their transport and feel safe and clean and not just have to choose the transport that they think they should, which is usually the car.
Great, thank you. And Gavin?
I can be very brief because I've already said mine, which I think would be the 15-minute city idea, which worth just doing a search for it if you're not familiar with it. Gaining quite a lot of traction in Paris and France, and yeah, well worth looking into, and that's certainly something we're really interested in exploring at Hubbub.
Perfect, thank you. And finally, Lewis.
It's a really difficult question, but I think if I had to ask for one thing, it would be to make sure that we continue to design services around demand and really start from that perspective rather than just building on what already exists. So wherever we design something new, we need to think about where people want to travel and make systems work for them rather than fixing and tweaking what already exists.
Perfect. Again, thank you so much to everyone, particularly our panelists, but of course all our audience members as well. We're going to wrap up now. Apologies for going a minute over, but yeah, please do check out the forthcoming webinars on our website, and hopefully we'll see you very shortly at one of those. All the best, everyone. Thank you.